This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
All righty. Welcome to episode 93 of the Awful Announcing Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Contes, and this week we are joined by one of the most respected reporters in Major League Baseball. You can read him at The Athletic. You can watch him on Fox and Foul Territory. He is Ken Rosenthal. Ken, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. You have you've covered Major League Baseball for a few decades now. Has your excitement for opening day and the start of the season changed over the years?
No, actually, Brandon, I'm just as excited for it as I always am. And I guess when you lose that excitement, maybe it's time to do something else, but I don't anticipate ever thinking the start of the season is not a great thing. It's always fun. And just to see all the storylines start to kind of form and take place, to me, it's the coolest part of the job, actually.
What was your first season covering baseball full-time?
1987.
87. What did you like better about covering the sport that first season as compared to covering it today?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say the access was better back then.
Yeah.
There weren't as many media outlets. It was a newspaper-driven world. There was no internet. And for that reason also, it wasn't 24/7. When your deadline hit, you were done until the next deadline the next day. So all of that was better. It was also, I wouldn't say the players were easier to deal with. They were more difficult to deal with, but the access to the manager, to the clubhouse, it was just more open. Now it's much more restricted, limited, I would say, and it's a bigger business than it was back then.
What do you like better about covering the sport today?
That more people can read or watch me than ever before. I'm not just working for the Baltimore Sun and writing for a Baltimore audience. Now, granted, that's because I'm a national writer, but really back then, there were no national writers. Maybe Peter Gammons at that time. I don't recall if he had moved to ESPN by then or not, but I don't think so. He was the Globe guy. And even though he was a national baseball writer, you had to find the Boston Globe to read Peter Gammons. So that part of it is better. I don't know that Twitter has made it better.
Yeah.
That's for sure. I would say it's made it worse. And that part of it where it's 24/7, really 365 days a year, pretty much. You can take away Christmas and Thanksgiving, and that's about it. That part of it is not as good. The sport used to shut down for 2 weeks at Christmas and really shut down. But overall, the job is still fun. I can't imagine it not ever being fun. It just changes over the years, and you've got to kind of roll with those changes.
What is your favorite rule change that has happened in Major League Baseball since the time you started covering to now?
That one's easy, Brandon, the pitch clock. And I say that because it just improved the pace of the game. It shortened games.
Yeah.
And not that 4-hour games are necessarily a bad thing. In some cases, there can be great things. But to move the game along and just to see it kind of proceed in a brisker pace, that was a big thing. And that change to me dwarfs all the others because the sport had become, for many people, borderline unwatchable, even for those of us who love it. So that to me was the big one for sure.
If I ask you that same question 30 years from now, what are the chances that your answer is the golden at bat rule?
I would say slim and none. And it's a fascinating thing. And I understand why people might think it attractive because in other sports, you want the ball in the best player's hands. Football, basketball, hockey to a lesser extent, but you definitely want your best player controlling the puck.
Yeah.
In baseball, you can't do that. There's a batting order, there's a sequence, and it has to be followed. But I had an interesting conversation with my colleague Jason Stark about this when he wrote the story that started this uproar. And Jason was kind of in favor of this. He liked the idea. And Jason is even older than me, been covering the game even longer than me. You would think he'd be a traditionalist, but he was of the mind that this would be a really interesting wrinkle for the game. And to me, it was just a step too far.
Yep.
I get it and I understand it, but it's not baseball at that point. And navigating an order to stay away from a hitter or get to a hitter. That's part of the game. And with the golden at bat, it would change dramatically.
Yeah, no, it would definitely be interesting, but I feel like the game is in a great place right now, especially after the pitch clock. I think the pitch clock has been fantastic. It's almost like, I mean, I was watching baseball regularly anyway, but it has kind of like reinvigorated me as a baseball fan. Like I'm locked into the game much more now than I was in recent years. That there's a ton of talent, a player in Shohei Ohtani who has the ability to be the sport's biggest star maybe ever. But something like the golden at bat rule, I think it just was too gimmicky even for me. How did you go from local reporter to national insider? Was that a natural progression, or was it something that you kind of saw? Because like you had said, there really, when you got started, there really weren't many national reporters or insiders at that time.
It was something I sought, but not something that I had ever planned on. And let me explain. So I was a columnist at the Baltimore Sun from 1991 to 2000, general sports columnist. I covered Olympics, I covered Super Bowls, NBA Finals, baseball, everything. And I loved the job. But the Baltimore Sun was changing at the time. There was new leadership brought in, and they preferred the people that they were bringing in over the people that were there already. Now, I was not in danger of losing my job necessarily, but if you watch the season of The Wire about the Baltimore Sun, you'll know what I was talking about. So that was a factor. But the biggest thing was, there was one night I'm in Baltimore and ESPN Sports Center is on, and one of my friends, I can't remember whether it was Tim Kirkton or Jason Stark, but one of those guys was on. And my wife said to me, "Why can't you do that?" And I still was baseball focused, even though I was a general sports columnist. Baltimore only had baseball and had just gotten football. So I thought, okay, you know what? I don't know that this job is going to be the right job forever. And I started looking around for a national job, a national baseball writing job. And ultimately, I got one at the Sporting News, and it did change things, obviously, in my career considerably, not in a way I ever expected. I never expected to be on television or anything like that. I was just looking to get to a place where the internet age was kind of beginning, and Paul Allen was the owner of the Sporting News. Now, it didn't work, but he was the guy from Microsoft. You thought it was going to work. And it just seemed like the right move at the time. I had no idea, none, what would happen to newspapers. In fact, a lot of people at the time, including the sports editor of the Washington Post, who was someone I knew, said, "You're nuts. What are you doing? You're leaving a premier job in our industry, a big city columnist for a big newspaper." But I just felt it was time, and time for a new challenge. I could have maybe stayed at the Baltimore Sun and written columns about the Orioles and the Ravens for years and years. But at some point that becomes a little bit limiting, even though I loved it. So that was kind of the story. And if not for my wife, I don't know that I would have had the thought in my head to do what I did.
That's interesting. Were you always comfortable on television?
No. In fact, at the start, when I was on Cold Pizza, ESPN's Cold Pizza, which was the forerunner of First Take, I would speak about 9 miles a minute. I was way too fast. And then when I got to Fox, they did give me the chance to be the dugout reporter for games. And I didn't really know what I was doing. They eventually sent me to a coach who slowed me way down, almost too much, actually too much. And then I had to kind of readjust. But no, it took a lot of time. And even today, after all these years, it's not always natural. There are weird things about it. And yes, I've grown much more comfortable to the point where, yes, I can say I'm reasonably comfortable, but I don't know that you're ever comfortable talking live on television. That is an unusual thing to do. Some people do it extremely well.
How did the Bowtie start? Where did that come from?
So that came from the guy who was the head of Fox Sports at the time, his name was David Hill, and he's a legend in the industry. He's basically the guy who created Fox Sports. He's from Australia. He is a big personality. And this was, I believe, 2012. And he basically said, I want to distinguish that guy. I want to put him in a bow tie. I hated the idea. This was the playoffs that year, the NLCS. I was totally like appalled by it, but he was the boss. And the reason I was appalled by it was I thought that your work is what should make you stand
Sure.
out. That's the way I was raised in the industry. And what I didn't understand is television is a little different, and personality and all of that comes into it more. So he ordered me to start wearing the bow tie in the NLCS that year. And I did it in the World Series as well. And I remember the first time Joe Buck came to me and we talked about it. He said, well, Ken, how's that bow tie going? And I said, I'm playing this World Series under protest. And I didn't like it. But that winter offseason, Dhani Jones, a former NFL player who had this nonprofit, the Bow Tie Cause, came to me and said, hey, would you wear our bow ties that represent different charities every week? And at first, my reaction was, no way, I'm not doing this ever again. And then I thought, wait a second. David Hill is going to want me to keep doing this. This way I get some control over it. And that's how it really got going. Now, David no longer works for Fox, but once in a while I'll see him and he'll say something to me along the lines of, I put you in the bow tie and I was right. And he was right, because that is how a lot of people identify me. When I go out, people ask me all the time if I'm dressed like this or even with a regular tie, where's the bow tie? So he got it right. He knew what he was doing. He always did. And that's the story.
What is it like interviewing a manager or a player during the game from the dugout? Is it challenging to get their attention, challenging to keep it?
It's not challenging to get their attention. Those interviews are generally prearranged. Now, the ones during the playoffs where you're interviewing a player right after he does something big, it's something we started a couple of years ago. That's not prearranged, obviously, but we have a list of players who are willing to do it. So when I approach a player in that circumstance, he generally understands that that might happen. Now, there are times he might say, not now, it's not good, but it's challenging asking the right questions in such a short amount of time. Those interviews, the ones in the dugout with the players, are a minute or less. That's why I always am amused when people say, get out of the dugout. Those things are disruptive. No, they're not disruptive. They take seconds. So that's challenging, asking the right questions. And I try to keep the questions as short as possible because I want the player or the manager or the coach to speak for that time, not having me speak. But yeah, they're definitely different.
Yeah, so many fans complain about in-game interviews, especially on social media. You see those complaints a lot. And I totally get social media is largely a place where people share negative feelings about something. But do you get more positive feedback or negative feedback from fans on those in-game interviews?
Negative.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they can be really valuable. And actually, at first, I was really uncomfortable with the whole idea. The dugout is not a place where someone like me is supposed to be ever during a game. And that is ingrained for me forever. But I remember specifically the Phillies, and the first year we did it, this was 2022, and they had their big run to the World Series. And we had them the whole way. Fox had the National League that year. And those interviews, one, they captured the excitement of the players as they were kind of going along. And when Bryce Harper hit the huge home run that basically sealed the series against San Diego, to interview him in the dugout right after that, have him go through the at-bat, I'm sorry, that was invaluable. Now, is every interview great and revealing? No. But if you don't try, you're not going to get the good ones. And I actually believe that in other sports, this is much more accepted. Baseball is more traditional, and I understand fans have their opinions and they're entitled to them. But if you simply look at the value of some of those interviews, there is value. And I've gotten really good stuff in certain cases over the years doing those.
Does
From
major
managers too, by the way.
Yeah. Does Major League Baseball do a good job of marketing its stars nationally and even now globally?
I would say better than it used to. And for years, because of the labor issues in the sport, there was a feeling, I believe, in the league office that we don't really want to promote these guys. We don't want to make them bigger than they are. That has changed. Now, is baseball doing as good a job as it could be? I would say the answer to that is no. There is always more you can do. And part of this, honestly, is on the players too. The sport is one where I would say, unlike the NBA and maybe the NFL, guys are not individualists in the same sense. The culture of the sport is shut your mouth and play. And we know this, right? This is the old school rules, all this stuff. So that's part of the problem. But can the league do more? Sure, the league could do more. And there are times, even with Fox, and Fox is paying, I don't know how many billions for the rights, where it's tough to get an interview. That's ridiculous. And if it's tough for me in a playoff circumstance to get an interview with a player, imagine the beat writer and imagine even a national writer trying to do the same thing. That, to me, is part of the problem. The sport can promote the players better. The players can do a better job as well in being more open and just willing to do things.
The big thing in the NBA right now is who is the face of the league, or who will be the face of the league when if and when LeBron ever retires. Some players want it, some don't. Does Shohei Ohtani embrace being the face of baseball?
I would say no. And the reason for that is partly the language barrier. But Shohei Ohtani knows English. He can speak English. He chooses not to. Now, part of that might be he's simply not afraid is not the right word, but hesitant, like a lot of foreign-born players are, to speak in their second language on television.
Yep.
That is completely understandable. I wrote a story about Acuna, who now is trying to speak English in interviews this spring, in which I tried to convey that that's a really hard thing to do. Try doing it yourself, right, in another language. So I get it. But he also is private. He also rarely does one-on-one interviews of any kind. So he does not embrace it. Now, you might say, why does he need to embrace it? He is the biggest star. We all enjoy watching him play and all the amazing things he does. Does he really need to do more? And I don't know that the answer to that is actually yes. He's a pretty big star without having to do anything. And as for the face of the game, he's certainly one of them. But this is a sport that is not as national as some others. It's more locally oriented. The fans follow their favorite teams. So in Los Angeles, Shohei sure is the face of the sport, but so is Mookie Betts. So is Freddie Freeman. In New York, it's Aaron Judge. In Kansas City, it's Bobby Witt Jr. I don't know that it's as big a deal in baseball as it is in basketball, like you mentioned.
Do the Dodgers want Shohei to do more, be available to the media more?
I don't believe the answer to that is yes. They want Shohei to do whatever the heck he wants, and they will allow him to do whatever the heck he wants. Now, they're going to ask at times, and will, but they're cool with what Shohei's doing. They like what Shohei's doing for them. He's making them a lot of money and winning them a lot of games.
Speaking of big stars, how was working with Joe Buck at Fox?
I loved it. And I thought people who criticized him were so off base. It's jealousy to some regard. It's also, they're just so familiar with him. They hear him all the time. They want to hear someone else, maybe. I don't know. This guy's the best. And he was and is a master of his craft. And there were things he would do during a broadcast that were so subtle. I would notice them after a while when I got more understanding of what television was. But again, he was masterful. And I'll give you one example. There was a playoff game in 2009, Angels-Yankees. And Tim McCarver and I got off on some tangent about how if the Yankees advanced, who was going to pitch, and this and that and the other thing. And Joe just really subtly steered the conversation back to the game, not chiding us, but saying, guys, it's 4-2 here. Let's go. And he did stuff like that all the time. And his calls are great. Everything about him in that booth. It's just, the guy is the best and one of the best to ever do it. And if people don't appreciate it because one time he said the Dodgers should have done this or Randy Moss should have done that, they're missing the boat. And I will say this as well. The lead play-by-play guy now for Fox, Joe Davis, he too is great.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of greatness. He's somewhat similar to Joe and somewhat different in other ways, but it's an honor to work with these guys. Honestly, they're all like amazing at what they do.
Yeah. Buck is calling the Yankees and Brewers for ESPN this week. I should know we're recording this on Wednesday. This podcast will drop on Friday, so Buck will have already called the game at that time. I know you're at Fox, but MLB and ESPN seem headed for a divorce. Being around the league as long as you have, is the relationship between Major League Baseball and ESPN important?
Yes, and I believe it's going to continue. The two teams need each other, and their relationship, and I'm speaking simply as an outsider, I don't know anything about the business, but it would seem to me that ESPN wants the content. They might want it in a different form than Sunday night or whatever. They might want more of the local games. I don't know how they would do it. And also baseball needs ESPN. Baseball is going to want to be on as many big outlets as possible, even with the streaming age upon us. And I just can't imagine them at least not wanting ESPN in the bidding for the rights and having some of those rights.
How was your time working for MLB Network?
It was good until the end.
Yeah.
And I will say this, Brandon, honestly, I understood the decision not to bring me back, and I had no problem with it. Their idea was, hey, this guy is critical of the league. He's critical of the commissioner. We don't want him on our league-owned network. That is an absolutely understandable decision. You can't argue it. They're not a journalistic entity. They are a promotional vehicle. Now, early on, they were more of a journalistic entity. And when I came aboard in 2010, the idea was you do your thing. And there were moments under Tony Petitti when he ran the network where he actually encouraged me to do some things that were critical. But things change, and I understood that. What I didn't understand was how this could go on for years. This went on for a long time before this decision was made, the conflict. And it should have ended sooner, to be perfectly honest. I'm glad it didn't in many ways. I have so many friends there still, and I miss those people. But the relationship was not good, and understandably not good from their perspective and even from mine. My eyes are wide open. I understood what was going on.
So did you, while you were there, did you worry that being critical of Manfred or the league might cost you your job with MLB Network?
I didn't really think of it like that. I was just doing my job, and if it cost me my job, so be it. Now, I will say this. At the time, I had Fox, of course, and The Athletic. So I was not in a position where, let's say MLB Network was my only employer. Maybe then I'm not so pure in my mind, and maybe I'm a little more careful. I don't know. I've never been that way. When I was at the Baltimore Sun, I was critical of people. So that was a time when I had only one job. But I did have that cushion. I knew I had that cushion. So I was just going to be the same person I've tried to be the whole time. And if the outcome was that outcome, that was just the way it was going to be.
What is your relationship like with Rob Manfred? And do you have to have a good relationship with Manfred to cover the league?
No, you don't. But it is professional. And when I have questions, he will answer the questions. There's no ostracize this guy, anything like that. Now, there are things that happen from time to time. I won't go into detail, that I can sense are driven by him and where he wants certain coverage to go. But that's his absolute right. And just as it's any source's right to pick whoever he wants to deal with or not.
How long were you working on the Astros cheating scandal story before that went public?
Well, it really was Evan Drellick's story. And Evan Drellick was aware of it from the previous season when he was working for NBC Sports Boston. And he couldn't quite bring it home. He didn't quite have it. And once he got to the Athletic, he said to me, hey, I'd like to work on this. And I don't remember the exact sequencing. It's in his book. And let's say he got to the Athletic at the start of the following season, which was, say, April. And we talked about it. And then it was really not until September, October when I got very much involved in the reporting of it. So he had a lot of it done, but we kind of picked it up later, and I was more involved. I wouldn't say at the end because it was a longer time period than that, but this was really Evan's story. Now, I did a lot of help and a lot of work on it, but it was his thing. He knew it, and he just needed a vehicle, which turned out to be The Athletic, in which he could report it and report it out well.
Did you realize how big this? So when Evan first brought it to you, did you realize how big this story was potentially going to be right away?
No, and I'll tell you a very funny story. I tell this story a lot, but the day it broke, the day we published, we were at the general managers meetings in Phoenix, and Evan and I are standing there, and Evan says to me, this is going to be the biggest story I've ever done. And I looked at him and I said, that's ridiculous. We'll have a bigger story next week. This is just one story. Because I was so in the moment, and we were so busy and working so hard to get the story out. It just seemed, in a way, to be another story. And I wasn't thinking about the impact. I was thinking about nailing every detail and covering every base and all that. And my head was down. So he realized it. I didn't. Obviously, it was a huge story.
Did anyone ever attempt to get the story quashed before it was out?
No, we had it. There was no quashing. With the Boston story that followed, the one about the Red Sox, what they did was not as egregious. There was a little bit more pushback and things along those lines going on, but quashed would not be the right word. It certainly didn't happen with the Astros story. What we had was what we had. We had Mike Fiers on the record, and we had the details of how this whole thing went down, and their hands were in the cookie jar, right? With the Red Sox, it was a little bit more nebulous. There were things that went on, and we reported them, but there was more pushback with that one.
What is something that you wrote or a story report that you had that may have had the biggest impact on your career? Is there one?
I don't know that there's one. And honestly, the Astro story is separate from anything I've ever done, because that was such a big story. But by that point, I was at The Athletic as the national baseball writer. It's not like it changed my career trajectory. And there wasn't any story before that that really did it. I like to think, and maybe it's my own hubris, that it's the whole thing. It's the whole career, the breadth of the career, every story that leads you to be a person that is thought of in a certain way. And you'll have some missteps along the way, but the body of work is what I'm talking about. And I would hope that's what stands out.
What are the odds that we're headed for another lockout in 2026?
Quite high. And if I wanted to put a number on it, I would say 90%.
Oh, wow.
Now, that doesn't mean we're going to miss games.
Yeah.
It doesn't even mean we'll get to the point where it's an extended lockout. But the commissioner already is on record with Evan as saying, we think lockouts can be a good thing, healthy to the process, which is a questionable remark. But there is a lot of tension right now, mostly driven by the owners who want a cap. And we'll see where this goes. Now, we hear these things. People say, well, this time they really want it and they're willing to miss games. We hear this all the time. But my concern is we're hearing it a little earlier than we've heard it in the past. And it seems that the desire of the owners to do something along those lines is more fervent than in the past. Maybe I'm wrong about that, because it's always fervent to have a cap. But what I have a really hard time seeing is why you would take a $12.1 billion industry and take it down. And that to me makes no sense. And ultimately, while we may have some stoppage or some kind of disruption in the labor situation, missing games is still hard for me to believe.
Is baseball heading for a realignment in the near future? I remember Howie Rose was on WFAN last year. He said something along the lines of expecting to see the Mets and Yankees in the same division within 5 years is what he had said, and may have been a little bit in jest, but is that something that is on baseball's radar?
It is, but only if they expand to 32 teams. And that is kind of problematic right now because with Tampa Bay, there's no resolution. Now, once there's resolution with Tampa Bay and once baseball is certain that the A's are going to Las Vegas, they say they're certain, we'll all believe it when we see it. Then you have a situation where, okay, the two teams that were having stadium issues and location issues, they will have that resolved. Then you can expand to 32, collect your $2 billion expansion fee from each franchise and go forward. And with 32, you go to 8 4-team divisions. And yes, it would be realignment and most likely along geographical lines. Where else would you do it? Would the Mets and Yankees be in the same division? Dodgers and Angels be in the same division? I'm not sure how they're looking at it, but that certainly would be possible under a realignment situation.
Last thing, what potential storyline are you most excited to follow this year? Is it Ohtani pitching again? Is it the Dodgers chasing 117 wins? Paul Skeens? I don't know. Is there something about this season that you're most excited to see and follow?
I would say how the Dodger thing unfolds. And I know a lot of people are saying they're going to dominate. They're going to go all the way. It's easy. They've got all the best players. I understand the discussion, and you just mentioned 117 wins. That might be the over-under. I don't know. But the game is not that easy. And even for the Dodgers, they get knocked out in 2022 in the division series, knocked out in 2023 in the division series, and nearly knocked out in 2024 in the division series. And in fact, by the time this airs, I will have had a story out there with my top storylines for the season. And in that, I quote Dave Roberts, the Dodgers manager, as saying, well, to go back to back, the key thing, we have to get to the second round because he knows that best of 5 division series, how problematic it can be. So I don't think it's a given, and we'll see how it all plays out. Some of the teams in the West have improved too. Diamondbacks are better. Giants are better. Padres are good. So I'm interested to see all that. And then within the Dodger thing, there's Shohei and what he does. There's Mookie at shortstop. There is Sasaki coming into the league. There are all these different questions, how they're going to handle their pitching. They're just going to be a really interesting team. But I would not say they are the only interesting team at all. And in fact, one of the things I love most about the sport, and I actually mentioned this in that story, once opening day starts, we've got 30 soap operas lasting 6 months each, and you don't know how it's going to unfold. And Skeens is a great example. I can't wait to see what Skeens does this year. Cam Smith, the rookie the Astros are promoting. I can't wait to see if this kid can really play. So there are all these things in the game that you follow, and then there are things that we cannot even anticipate that are going to happen. That's the beauty of the whole thing. It's a mystery that's about to unfold.
Ken, you were great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Brandon, thank you.
That is Ken Rosenthal. I'm Brandon Contes. This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast. Please also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page. But regardless of how you consume Awful Announcing and the Awful Announcing Podcast, thanks for listening and be good.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.